to move actually quite a few centuries from where Margaret has begun to perhaps more contemporary questions. And yet Margaret's paper has illustrated extremely vividly that these, inasmuch as they are questions for us today, concern history. At the bottom of this is the question of history itself. As Christians, we understand ourselves to be a historical people. But the question in my mind is always, whose history is it that is at stake? If I've learnt one thing above all from my many friends among Latter-day Saints, it is the overwhelming sense of a continuity of history, not, let us say, simply from Joseph Smith's first visions and the early stirrings of Mormonism from the 1820s onwards, but a history understood as itself founded in Adam's expulsion from Eden, in the experience and proclamations of the prophets, in the wandering and formation of peoples who at times have called themselves the children of Abraham, the nation of Israel, the children of, or the church, the life, people who live in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is not, therefore, strictly speaking, a human history. This is this question: whose history is at stake? Rather, it is the history itself of divine revelation. At the center of this history is the patriarchal priestly figure of Adam and the city of his dwelling place, which again has gone under various names, but is always rooted in the meaning of the places we know as the garden, as Eden, as Jerusalem, as the temple, but most importantly of all, as the city. It is not without significance that of all modern Christian traditions, only Mormons, I think, have self-consciously preserved the very ancient distinction between the temple and other localities of worship. And how you've preserved that, and what I think, how that was reflected in my own tradition, is something that I want to explore as we proceed. In contrast to your own tradition, the presence of the temple appears to modern Catholics something quite strange. This strangeness carries with it a sense of distance. We always end up, I remember the first time I flew in to Salt Lake to meet with my very good friend Bradford Houston, who's here today. And I didn't know an awful lot about Mormonism at that stage. And as we flew over, the pilot alerted us to, it was night. It was November the 21st, actually. It was a very clear night. And he said, you can see the Salt Lake Temple. And Brad picked me up from the airport. And I said, what's this thing, the temple, that you lot have got here? I've come a long way since then. If we non-Mormons think to ourselves that much of what occurs in your temples is hidden from us, yet more hidden is our own proximity to the temple as it manifests itself in what I've called in my paper creedal Christianity. By creedal, I just mean non-Mormon Christianity. It's difficult to find. This proximity is one for which we have much less reason to feel disbarred. There is no sense in which our access to our churches is nowadays ever limited, except when they function more as museums and tourist attractions than as places of worship. By that I mean, you have to pay to go in to medieval cathedrals in my country now, which really breaks my heart. Fortunately, it's against canon law in the Catholic Church to charge money to enter a Catholic church. But in Italy, they've even got around that. So you do have to pay. Now you have to pay in Catholic churches in Italy that are maintained by the state to light the lights up to see the treasures. Some of you may have had this experience in cities in Italy. That's how we hide our access to our version of the temples. If Mormons are, and I think often unjustly, accused of being secretive about your temple, we are keeping secrets, I think, that we do not even have the interest or understanding to acknowledge that we are keeping. The consequences, I believe, have been and continue to be very serious for much of creedal Christianity. The American Catholic theologian, he's actually a very recent convert to Catholicism, Catholic theologian Stephen Webb has said, the next great phase of ecumenical Christian dialogue with other religions has to begin with the conversation between Orthodox Christians and Latter-day Saints. So, it's something I passionately believe myself. Over the last years, I've come increasingly to believe that statement to be true, because my many Mormon friends and interlocutors have helped me, often unwittingly and despite themselves, to uncover for myself and perhaps for others the roots of Catholicism and of creedal Christianity in the temple. In other words, whereas so often dialogue between creedal and Mormon Christians begins with us believing ourselves to be reaching out to groups with rather surprising views, cut off from mainstream belief, in reality, it is creedal Christians who have most been cut off. This is the point I made earlier. Cut off from the mainstream. That stream of history, which is the stream of God's self-disclosure in the history of the earth. There is so much more that I would want to say about that, but time forbids it. About the way contemporary creedal Christians have taught ourselves to handle and read biblical texts, something that Margaret's illustrated so wonderfully, I think, this morning. I'm sure you would agree. Without context, as is taking these texts up without their context, apart from the history of how they've appeared, with what we believe is a literalness that is in fact an interpretation. Something I point out to my students when I'm teaching. Even fundamentalism is an interpretation. There is no such thing, in my opinion, as a literal interpretation of any text. To prove that, I actually took some students through the back of a cornflake packet to show them what's going on needs to be interpreted and is itself situated in a complex web of political ideas, legal ideas, historical ideas, ideas about self-image and so forth. You look at the back of a cornflake packet. You know those FDA recommendations? There's the legal framework at work. And the advertising, all of that. There is no such thing as the literal reading of any text. And that means that all fundamentalisms are themselves interpretations. We have, therefore, to set aside many of our contemporary understandings of what we are doing for the sake of perhaps one very simple understanding that I believe has the power to open up the most fruitful possibilities of dialogue. And that understanding is simply this. We have to understand the meaning of the presence of the temple, both historically and in the present day. The biographer of Joseph Smith, Richard Lynam Bushman, draws our attention to something that is perhaps not well understood, I suspect possibly even by many contemporary Mormons, when he begins to discuss the revelation given to Joseph Smith in late 1830, in which Christ says, "I will suddenly come to my temple." A revelation which was followed by a more specific one in December 1832, that the early Mormons should establish, and the revelation said, a house of God. While there is no amplification of this revelation in his private journals, as far as I can find, I know some of the editors are here, so they can correct me. The editors of the Joseph Smith papers note that, and I quote, "In June, Joseph Smith and the presidency developed plans for temples in Kirtland and Missouri and for expanded Mormon settlement in each city." Now, Bushman comments on this. Temples were at first an empty form, awaiting content. When I said earlier that I think Joseph Smith and other charismatic religious founders, St. Francis would be one for Catholics, or St. Benedict, have an openness to God. That openness takes concrete form. An empty temple awaiting content is awaiting a revelation of God. That I really think that's what we have to understand. The concreteness of the way God reveals himself. A lot of modern Catholics, a lot of modern Christians seem to think that God zaps you in some peculiar way, or that they are, I hope I'm not insulting anyone who's present here today, but some evangelicals talk as if they had a telephone wire from the back of their head up to heaven. This is not how God reveals himself. God reveals himself through concrete things. A temple is the focus of that concretion. Bushman speaks of how Joseph Smith was, he says, characteristically nonchalant about weekly congregational worship, something other Mormons at the time were energetic about resolving. The Mormons around Joseph Smith wanted Mormons to be in church on Sunday. And my goodness, you do church on Sunday. In the Catholic Church, we can't get away with it. Except my tradition, traditional Catholicism, which you go in and sometimes you don't know when you're going to get out. But anyway, there you go. I went to a liturgy in St. Louis on the way here, like that. It was supposed to be an ordinary Mass, but it happened to be a confirmation as well. And I said to my friend who was with me, I hope you're not hungry. Bushman contrasts Joseph Smith's nonchalance about weekly worship with his energetic determination to build temples wherever Mormons were settled. This was at the risk of the financial ruin of the Mormon church, he says. He notes of the disaster, that's the word he uses, of temple building in the 1830s, commenting, the economic realities gave Joseph no pause. Bushman's account of the appearance of the temple in Mormon life makes clear what is hinted at by the editors of the Joseph Smith papers, of whom Bushman is also one. Bushman draws our attention to a comment of the Catholic historian Gary Wills, who, speaking of the history of the United States, says, and I quote, "There is no more defining note to our," meaning American history, "than the total absence of a sacred city in our myths, with the exception, I would suggest, of the Mormon temple, fetched like Jerusalem's from heaven." That's Gary Wills saying that. The Mormon temple, has some connection with the American founding myth. I think that's correct. The temple as the pinnacle and sanctification of the city, of what Joseph Smith and elsewhere you can find in the Christian tradition is called Zion and its satellites, is at the root of Joseph Smith's foundation of Mormonism. The temple is without content because its content is not realized in human planning. Smith received revelation that said that when the Kirtland temple was complete, and I quote, "a cloud shall rest upon it, which cloud shall be even the glory of the Lord." A later revelation said, "My glory shall be there, and my presence shall be there." God fills the temple. The temple is not primarily concerned with the quotidian worship and instruction of individual souls. For that, a chapel suffices. The temple stands at the center of the city as the means by which the glory of the Lord is revealed on the face of the earth and the means by which the work of the Lord is done. Both the objective and subjective genitives apply here. The work done is the work God does on behalf of humanity. At the same time, whatever work is done in accordance with what God lays down for the life of the temple is a work that belongs to and is of God. This is what I think Joseph Smith means when he talks about work in this context. This work is not, therefore, a work of humanity, even when it's done at human hands. It is always a work of the Lord. I've written elsewhere about how, in Catholic contexts, about how priesthood is the work of God done by human hands. I think that's a correct understanding, at least for Catholics, of what priesthood is. It is the means, therefore, by which the work of the Lord is done to redeem and sanctify, to renew, to restore, all these words that we've heard Margaret using already, the face of the earth, and how that is to be understood and how it's actually lived. Bushman notes that, and I quote, "Only in the New World could such a scheme have been carried out," of Joseph Smith's radical understanding of the formation of cities around temples. Too little has been written of or made of Joseph Smith's understanding of the New World, I think, as a place of the sanctifying and renewing work of God, including, to a large extent, Catholicism in this country, in its public face. It seems to me that it's only Latter-day Saints that in recent times have challenged the understanding of religion as a matter primarily of personal assent. In the New World, only Mormons, therefore, have, I think, understood what it means for a nation, a nation coming to birth, also to have a soul. That is, an inner unity and a sense of destiny whose redemption is itself necessarily and only possible as a work undertaken by and through the presence of God, the Lord, of Yahweh. When commentators suggest that Mormonism is a most American of religions, they often fail to understand the extent to which Mormonism, especially through the life and person of Joseph Smith, attempted to address what it meant to build America. It is a most American of religions in the sense that Mormonism is, for me as a non-Mormon, a profound engagement with and expression of the emerging American soul. Only this understanding can explain the extraordinary history of persecution and rejection of Mormons in your own land, in a world that from the very outset was established with a founding mythic narrative of providing refuge for religious dissent. That's a paradox for me, coming from Europe. The New World has been able to provide almost limitless refuge for religious belief of almost every kind, no matter how bizarre or extraordinary, but solely on the basis of private belief and private practice. If Richard Bushman has correctly identified the New World as a place where it was at least topologically possible for Joseph Smith's vision of Zion and of the sanctified city to take place, historically, the governing metaphysic of the New World was able only with the greatest reluctance, if at all, to yield any place for this vision within its topography. Bushman begins his biography of Smith with a most extraordinary and prescient parallelism, especially for me as a scholar of Nietzsche. I'm really a philosopher. That's my day job, as it were. Because he begins his biography with a comparison of Joseph Smith and of Ralph Waldo Emerson. For Emerson's transcendentalism and deism is the inverse image of the Mormon understanding of the work of the Lord, that is, of a nation under God, but in Emerson's case without any locus, without any right, without any priesthood, to make manifest what this being under God means or how it unfolds. Such a being under God for Emerson, therefore, becomes a contentless sense of the divine. This is, in other words, the inverse of a temple. Whereas for Joseph Smith, the building of a temple is a temple without content that awaits the presence of the Lord. Transcendentalism claims to understand who God is, and therefore declares no temple is necessary because we already know God. I hope you see the mirror image. This, therefore, becomes at its worst a meaningless and purely formulaic expression that finds its way onto the insignia of state and, frankly, your dollar bills. In contrast, and even to a non-Mormon like myself, the Mormon temple is unintelligible except as the diadem of a sanctified city. We must ask, therefore, is it for that reason that the establishment of the temples in Kirtland and Missouri was in 1833 inseparable from the plans for expanded Mormon settlement in both of those cities? I think the answer has to be yes. If the first years of the 19th century marked the opening of the possibility of the establishment of a temple religion in the New World, it seems to me that they mark the end of a form of temple religion in the old, in my world, the European world, in a way that again has been too rarely understood or considered. In Europe, the 19th century opened with events that signalled the end of one world and the dawn of quite another, a world quite different from what went before. And this dawn had been long in coming. It took centuries to arrive, and its arrival is still, I think, being finished off even now. Napoleon's Concordat with Pope Pius VII of 1801 signalled, and decisively, the end of the medieval world. An end that had begun with the unfolding of Protestantism, which, if we wanted to date it, perhaps began in 1517, but whose roots stretch possibly a full 3 centuries and more before. Now, the significance of that concordat, or agreement, between Napoleon and Pius VII is this. Whereas in times past, centuries past, Catholic Christianity in the whole of Western Europe would call itself the religion of the state, from now on, from 1801 onwards, and in the Napoleonic world which replaced Catholic Christianity in all the non-Reformation states of Western Europe, Catholicism could at the very best claim only to be the religion of the majority of the citizens of that state. It went from being a public religion to being a religion which had public expression but demanded only private assent. It's a fundamentally important thing to understand. Even in the Reformed states, the states which were essentially Protestant, which still had a state religion, Britain would be the best example, but I think also Scandinavia and many of the German states before they were unified into modern Germany. The emphasis was on a state religion, and so, but nevertheless, and Catholic Austria also worked like this, a state religion rather than a universal form of religion to which a particular state subscribed. So, the Anglican Church is the state religion, rather than Britain as it was, or England as it was before the Reformation, being a Catholic country which subscribed to a universal understanding of Christianity. It's a fundamental shift. What Napoleon's Concordat brings to the fore, and at the same time crystallizes as the legal basis of the practice of religion across the whole of Europe, is what had already been the case in the New World, from the time when the European settlers first arrived on these shores, that religious belief is fundamentally an issue of the assent and construction of the will. I often say to students, I teach philosophy, and often they talk about believing in God as an assent of the will, and to a certain extent it is, but they get what that means really wrong. As I point out to them that whether or not, if you believe in God and God doesn't exist, your assent means nothing. Or if you don't believe in God and God does exist, then your assent means nothing. You have this notion of the assent of the will does not get us off the hook of the question of who God is. They struggle with that. Religious people don't struggle with it as much, although increasingly the understanding of God as someone I assent to becomes an understanding that there's only certain kinds of God I'm going to assent to. I'll give you an example of that. My previous boss, the former Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, preached at his enthronement ceremony that I assisted at on the fact that hell didn't exist. And there was a priest sitting next to me. He was a bit of a wag, and he whispered in my ear, "I hope for his sake that's true." But I think you get the point. It's not up to us to decide who God is going to be. For Catholics to recover for ourselves an understanding of Christianity as a temple religion would require two things. The first is an understanding of how historically the life and practice of Catholicism was itself, and until the eclipse of the medieval world, an essentially temple practice. And many of the clues to this are contained in our liturgical life, not as it now is, having undergone a century of the most fundamentally aggressive reform, but as it was when it formed the heart of not just religious life, but urban and country life, and when the Catholic Church herself had the power to shape and determine the face of Europe. And the second thing that we need to understand is what has taken the place of the religion of the temple as the medieval world has given way to the modern. And in what remains of my time, I want to examine both these themes in a way that I hope as succinctly as I'm able to explain what I mean. If you roam around in England, and I know many of you have, or if you travel almost anywhere in Western Europe, you will come across time and again cities that have at their heart a capital church building, often, by the way, built by a river on a hill. You know, I think of Durham and I think of York as two cities classically like that. A cathedral church built on a hill, which is meant to symbolize the Temple Mount, by a river, which is meant to symbolize the waters that pass through the temple. I was never taught that. You know, I had to learn that from Mormons. That's why, and from Margaret. You know, and then when you see it, it's obvious. You know, and I think, how did I not see this? And if you go to Cornwall, by the way, you'll see that churches, the ancient churches, and that's where my family comes from, ancient churches are always built on hills. You know, they were symbolizing the temple when they were building these churches. Now, these churches are not just cathedrals. They're often abbeys, or what we call in England minsters. You'll have been to some of these grand churches which are not just parochial churches or chapels. They were always administered not by one cleric, but by a group of clergy, often quite large groups. Sometimes they were called canons. Sometimes they were in religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Sometimes they weren't in religious vows, and they weren't therefore in vows of. They were in a vow of chastity if they were priests, but they weren't in vows of poverty, and they lived actually quite good lives, but lives in common. In significant cases, the communities that ran them could be female rather than male, although the ordained clergy were always male. The point of these churches, why they were bigger and had large groups of clergy rather than small chapels dotted around the place, is that they had the material, musical and spiritual resources to undertake, and in particular, by the way, to sing, the entire cursus of the sacred liturgy. Now, in the modern Catholic Church, most people will know the Mass. A few people will know what we call the breviary or the liturgy of the hours, but they won't really. It's a pale shadow of what it once was. But what went on in the cathedrals, what still goes on in abbeys, and what went on in these minsters was something huge. It was a vast cycle of prayer. It began in the night with the night office, the singing of what we call matins, which went on probably for 2 to 3 hours. It contained separate cycles of prayer, vespers, the prayer during the day. All of these were sung. And there were 3 cycles, in fact. There was the cycle of the day, the cycle of Mary or of Our Lady, which took place, you will have been into medieval cathedrals which have a lady chapel at the back. Well, the office of Our Lady was sung there. This wasn't just a nice extra bit of the building. Something happened in there. And then, and this will again be familiar to many Mormons, a liturgy of the dead. You couldn't always do the liturgy of the dead. On festal days, you couldn't. By the way, that wasn't because you didn't worry about the dead on festal days. It was because festal days particularly celebrated the resurrection, and therefore those days were already applied for the dead. But on other days, more penitential days, there was a whole liturgical cycle for the dead, prayer that was offered for the sake of souls who had gone before us. Very recognizable to Mormons. Contemporary public Catholic worship, except in the rarest places, is now almost entirely focused simply on the celebration of Mass, and more often than not in its said form rather than its sung form. It's only in about the middle of the Middle Ages that you're allowed to say Mass. And so you'll read accounts of people going into larger churches, and it was a cacophony during Mass. The offices were sung together, but every priest was under a certain obligation to say Mass individually. But you had to sing it. So they sang it in all those chapels around. all at once, at the same time. It was apparently cacophonous. It's an important point, therefore, that the singing was not for human ears. It was for the sake of the divine ear, which could hear the beauty in the cacophony. The original and underpinning cycle of Catholic worship, the singing, and by the way, Orthodox worship is the same, the singing of the sacred offices was overwhelmingly made up of the singing of the psalms, bracketed together with explanatory texts and canticles, sometimes taken from the New Testament, but often actually original compositions, the liturgical texts. Now, the psalms are above all temple songs, as Margaret's shown in much of her written work. But the classical interpretation of their meaning in the Catholic tradition is that they are to be understood as the eternal conversation between God the Father and God the Son. As temple songs, they are also priestly songs. This is why they are also always understood as to be the songs of the Levites. And they at the same time insert those, not who do the singing, but for whom they are sung, into the divine life. That is, the life that passes between the Father and the Son in the Spirit. That's why you have to be anointed in the Spirit in the Catholic tradition, to live between the Father and the Son. That's what it means for us. Again, many Catholics don't know this. This vast cycle, requiring many trained voices, complex ritual, long hours, went by the name of the Opus Dei. If you know your Latin, you will know that this is the work of God. It still goes on in a more limited form in contemplative Benedictine, Cistercian and Carthusian monasteries. In our towns and cities, it has fallen away. In medieval towns would have known that this work was going on. It was like their beating heart. The Dominican theologian Augustine Thompson has described how this works in some of his historical writings. A relic of it is the singing of evensong in Anglican cathedrals, which again many of you, I suspect, will have attended in your. But Britain is the one country that's kept even a pale shadow of this. This is temple worship in its classical form. It existed in many places for much more than 1,000 years, using rites that were almost unchanged over the whole of that time. Relics of it also exist among the Greek and Russian and other Orthodox churches. While the whole of the work of redemption is accomplished for us by the actions of Christ, the cursus which explains and unfolds the meaning of this divine plan and divine action on the face of the earth is too vast by far and too complex for any other individual than Christ to undertake alone, which tells you that it was never about the work that would be done by a single woman or a single man, even when it was all accomplished alone by Christ, the Son of God. The restoration and redemption of the cosmos is, as I said earlier, the work of God, using the word work, opus, in, I think, exactly the same way and same sense that it is being used in the revelations of Joseph Smith. And I think that's the significance. You have at the heart of your own tradition something which is an image of something in mind. It's what's brought me so close to an understanding of what Latter-day Saints not just believe but live. By the way, that assenting is a nonsense. You don't assent to God, you live in God. And that's what I teach my students. Stop believing in God as if you can, even Satan assents to God in the modern sense of believing in, but he doesn't live in God. To live in God is to become holy. That is what believing in God really means. We translate properly. Credo does not mean I believe. It means I belong. I am confessed to. These huge churches, which formed the centres of cities, were therefore places of pilgrimage and places where individual Christians in the medieval era went for very specific purposes. something that's familiar, I think, in the to Latter-day Saints. The origins of Mother's Day are, in fact, in this tradition. On not Mother's Day, but Mothering Sunday, which is still kept in my country, by the way, on this day. It's the fourth Sunday of Lent. You fixed it here, I think, in June. I can't remember. But in Britain, Mother's Day is still kept on the fourth Sunday of Lent. That was the day when many people made pilgrimage to the mother church of their diocese or their land, which was often an abbey or a minster. How can we explain why this temple understanding of the unfolding of Christian life has died away in Europe? Catholic theologians like Henri de Lubac, speaking from around the middle of the last century, began to speak about how creedal Christianity had been overtaken by a kind of individualism. De Lubac drew, I think, far too much attention to what he called the sociological fact of the body of Christ. He meant the gathering, the people who got together on Sunday, as the assembled community of the worshipping church, without understanding that this body is not, strictly speaking, the church community, so much as the holy city, the divinized polity or polis, which through the activity of priesthood and the constant realization of what it is that the temple realizes, the abiding presence of God in the world, is held in the life of God. De Lubac was to a certain extent, I think, still enmeshed in the very rationalism and individualism that he wanted to free himself from. Now, there is a modern resistance of all hierarchy because of the way in which the contemporary world is fundamentally bound to a notion of democracy. You know, you can't have somebody who belongs to a different rank or order than me because they might be better or worse than me. But religious life cannot live like this. In creedal Christianity, in contemporary creedal Christianity, you know, just being of a different rank in a Christian tradition does not mean being better or worse. I could point you to some very bad Catholic clergy, myself being one of them. You know? So, I mean, but we have overemphasized, you know, John Paul II, one of the most profound insights he ever had was that he said that the whole structure and order of the church was ordered to the producing of saints, not the producing of clergy. It's a very, very important point. Again, I think an idea that would be familiar to many Latter-day Saints. I hope that I have been able to show, therefore, that the medieval minster or major church functioned as a mother in which the work of God was undertaken, which was extended out into parish churches and little chapels that you'll find all over the place that were established for, let's say, what I called the quotidian day-to-day instruction of Christian souls, and for those important things like baptisms and burials and marriages. But what you call ordinances are very often the things that, as I understand medieval Christianity to have functioned, took place not in those churches, but in the minsters and in the. That's not an exact parallel here, and I don't want to overemphasize the parallel. But I give you just one concluding example. When my friend and I went to St. Louis on the day of the confirmation, that Sunday, a couple of weeks ago, there is a symbolic act where the bishop, who is symbolic of, he is Melchizedek, he is the symbolic of the ruler, both the ruler and the priestly figure in his diocese, comes into the church and enters the sanctuary, which is the place for the clergy alone. And he is then dressed in his formal priestly vestments, which are on the altar. And they are brought to him. He remains seated for this. It's quite difficult to change your clothes while you're seated. It involves a lot of shuffling. But his vestments are brought from the altar, which means that they're meant to symbolize for us heavenly vestments, which come to him from the altar, from the body of Christ, because the altar for us symbolizes the body of Christ. And he was then dressed. It took 20 minutes in total silence. You could have heard a pin drop because everybody in that church understood it. He then performed the ceremonies that needed to perform, the anointing of the people who were to be confirmed that day, and then he celebrated Holy Mass. And then he was undressed, and the priestly vestments were taken back to the altar. And the dressing and undressing is meant to be symbolized by angels, men dressed in black and white, coming down from heaven with these clothing him and then going back up. This is a temple ceremony, if ever I saw one. That, I think, is the heart of medieval religion, and it's the heart of medieval urban life. I tried very hard not to challenge my Latter-day Saint friends when I speak, because you have enough people to challenge you, and I have found only friendship among you. But I will challenge you with this. My friend Bradford Halston, in the course of my knowing him, has now a key figure in your. He's a key part of your temple construction group in your church headquarters, and he has alerted me to the fact that you are building temples all over the world. I sometimes phone him, and he'll say, "I can't tell you where I am, because if I did, you might tell somebody else, and we haven't announced a building of a temple in that city yet." But he's clearly not in Utah. You are, as Christians, the only people building really major monumental churches around the world. And one thing worries me about that. What you call the London Temple, I call Gatwick Airport. You are building these monumental churches outside cities and not in cities where I believe they belong. And if I were to offer you an entirely fraternal challenge, I would say remind the rest of Christianity of how religion lives and is the beating heart of urban life by moving your temples into the center of the cities where you are building them. Because if you could do anything to challenge what the Holy Father, Pope Benedict, has called secularism, it would be that. It is concrete symbols of Christian life and virtue and practice that affect, in my view, the modern world, not arguments. You want to see arguments, as we said at the beginning, turn on the television and watch political debates, and they are horrific. Whichever side you're on, they make you squirm. But lived virtue, in its humble and simple daily practice, humbles other people and makes them want to know more. And there I want to close. Thank you very much indeed.